All right, strap yourselves in, folks. Today, we're going deep on U.S.-China relations, and specifically the whole Taiwan situation. We've got this analysis from a Chinese observatory, and it's a pretty insightful look into how they see the global, well, chessboard, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it's not like they're claiming to see the future or
Kind
anything, but
of.
it does give us a feel for the kind of the forces at play. And honestly, this isn't just some abstract geopolitical game. This stuff could have real consequences for all of us. Global stability, the
Yeah.
tech we use, heck, even the prices of, everyday products.
Right, absolutely. So our source jumps right into the deep end here, talking about how a second Trump term, Trump 2.0 they call it, would basically mean a totally new era of American foreign policy. They go as far as labeling it imperialist. They even bring up stuff like Trump's comments about buying Greenland or taking control of the Panama Canal. I mean, what's the connection there? What are they getting at?
Well, they actually directly quote Trump here. He said something like, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, America should be able to acquire territory if it's in our interest. So the Chinese view is that this kind of talk, even if it's just rhetoric, it still sort of legitimizes their own, territorial claims, especially when it comes to Taiwan. It's like it creates this what's good for the goose kind of scenario, at least in their eyes.
So they're not just focused on what Trump actually does, but also how his words, how they might actually change the rules of the game. At least that's how they see it.
Exactly. And they link this whole thing to a bigger global trend they're seeing. They call it a carnivore versus herbivore mentality in international relations. Basically, the strong do what they can, and the weak just got to, well, suffer what they must. And you see this reflected in how they talk about um, Xi Jinping's ideas, the great changes unseen in a century. For them, this isn't just about China rising. It's about the West fundamentally declining. And this decline they talk about, it includes things like, rising populism in the U.S. and economic inequality. They see it all as making America weaker, more unpredictable.
So it's not just about like who has the bigger military or the stronger economy. It's about a nation's internal health, how those internal cracks could be, well, exploited. It makes me think of that saying, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy, and it kind of leads us right into their view of how China's own history shapes their actions today. They talk a lot about this period they call the century of humiliation. Basically, it was like 100 years of being, well, pushed around by foreign powers, and that experience it's deeply ingrained in their national psyche.
It's like they're not just trying to win the future, they're trying to, I don't know, rewrite the past in a way.
Yeah, it's more like reclaiming what they see as their rightful place in the world, And that brings us back to why Taiwan is such a flashpoint. It's not just about grabbing territory or resources for China. It's about this deep-seated need to, I guess, right a historical wrong, to complete what they call the national rejuvenation.
And they actually believe, according to this analysis, that a Trump 2.0 world would actually make this goal more achievable, which at first glance seems kind of counterintuitive. I mean, Trump's seen as pretty tough on China, isn't he?
Yeah, but their logic is actually pretty interesting. They say that Trump's America First approach and his, well, willingness to kind of ignore international norms actually plays into their hands.
Yeah.
Because it weakens those global institutions that could constrain China. Right. And it creates a more transactional, less ideological world.
So it's almost like they're saying if the rule book's out the window and it's all about deals and self-interest, well, guess what? We're pretty good at that game.
Exactly. And they highlight Trump's pragmatism, that whole deal maker image. They see it as evidence that he might actually be open to some kind of grand bargain, like maybe China offers some economic concessions, maybe something involving Taiwan's semiconductor industry. And in exchange, the U.S. Basically acquiesces to reunification.
Whoa. Okay. Now that's a pretty bold claim. Are they seriously suggesting that Trump would just, hand over Taiwan for the right price?
Well, they do acknowledge that it's risky. The analysis mentions, internal opposition within the U.S. as a potential deal breaker. And they even admit that miscalculations or miscommunication could easily escalate into, well, conflict. It's like they see this Trump 2.0 world as a high-risk, high-reward kind of situation.
So we've got China seeing opportunity in chaos, Taiwan's future hanging in the balance, and the potential for things to go very wrong very quickly. So where does this analysis go from here?
Well, before we get ahead of ourselves, it's important to remember that this whole analysis is coming from a very specific viewpoint, right? We're looking at this through China's own lens, their history, their ambitions, how they think the world works, all of that.
So not exactly a neutral take, then. We shouldn't treat this as some kind of prophecy.
Exactly. But even as just one, piece of the puzzle, it's still super revealing. It shows us how deeply these ideas, these narratives are embedded in their thinking.
Yeah.
Like this whole idea of China being destined to reclaim its former glory. And the flip side of that, the idea that America's in decline, making mistakes that ultimately benefit China.
And this carnivore versus herbivore thing,
Bring it on.
that's not just some random metaphor, is it? It feels like a pretty stark way of looking at global power dynamics.
No, it goes back to that social Darwinism idea we were talking about, survival of the fittest, right? And it's a view that's gaining traction, not just in China. You see it in other parts of the world, too. Like, remember when Macron, the French president, talked about Europe needing to grow teeth? It's not that different from what our source is describing here.
So it's like the old rules are breaking down, the gloves are off, and everyone's trying to figure out how to survive in this new, well, more ruthless world.
Right. And that makes everything much more unpredictable. Alliances shift, old certainties disappear, and the chance of, of someone misreading the situation and making a big mistake, it goes way up. Especially when you think about what's happening with Taiwan.
Okay, let's zoom back in on Taiwan for a second. What are the realistic scenarios here? Is a peaceful reunification, the kind China's hoping for, even possible?
The analysis suggests that it is, but only under some very specific circumstances. They'd have to offer Taiwan some really attractive concessions, probably focusing on the economic side of things. And even then, the U.S. would basically have to look the other way.
Which, as we discussed, seems pretty unlikely, given how politically charged this whole Taiwan issue is in the U.S.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even if some kind of deal was made between, the big powers, it's not like you can just force 23 million Taiwanese people to accept it. They have their own identity, their own democracy, their own vision for the future.
So if a peaceful deal is off the table, does that mean the only other option is war?
It's a scary thought, but it's a possibility we have to consider. The analysis actually puts specific odds on a military confrontation happening in the next few years.
Yeah, I remember reading that. Those numbers were pretty sobering. And they only get worse as we get closer to 2027, that symbolic deadline China seems to be focused on.
Which is exactly why the next few years are going to be so crucial. Every action, every statement, every military exercise, it'll all be scrutinized, overanalyzed, looking for any sign of escalation.
It's like walking a tightrope over a volcano, and the stakes are incredibly high. This isn't just about the fate of one island. We're talking about a conflict that could drag in the entire region, maybe even the world.
It's a classic security dilemma, Each side feels threatened by the other, so they build up their militaries, which in turn makes the other side even more nervous. Any miscalculation, any misstep could set off a chain reaction.
So is there any way to de-escalate this situation, or are we just heading for some kind of inevitable clash?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Honestly, it would take a level of diplomacy and long-term thinking that, frankly, we haven't seen much of lately.
From both the U.S. and China.
From everyone involved. It'd take clear communication, a genuine willingness to find some common ground, and a real understanding that everyone has something to lose here. But even then, you also have to factor in all the internal pressures each side is facing.
Right. Like in the U.S., you've got that America First faction pushing for a more confrontational approach to China. And within China, you've got Xi Jinping trying to, solidify his power, with Taiwan being a key part of his legacy.
It's this whole tangled mess of motivations, ideologies, historical baggage. It's enough to make your head spin.
And somewhere in the middle of all of this is Taiwan, just trying to navigate these incredibly choppy waters. Makes you wonder how much control they even have over their own future.
We were talking earlier about Taiwan's agency. That's the big question here, isn't it? Are they in control of their own destiny, or are they just pawns being moved around on the board?
It's got to feel like living in a pressure cooker, knowing your whole existence could be decided by, decisions made in Beijing or Washington.
And that's why understanding Taiwan's internal dynamics is so important.
Mm-hmm.
What are their different political factions? What strategies can they use to try and secure their own future?
Because if this analysis is even half right, they're going to need all the ingenuity and resilience they can get.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on this analysis, looking at how China sees the U.S.-China relationship, and especially the future of Taiwan. As we start to wrap things up, what are some of the biggest, takeaways for our listener? What should they walk away with?
I think the main takeaway is just, the sheer complexity of it all. We're talking about historical wounds that haven't healed, totally different worldviews clashing, economies that are completely intertwined, militaries building up,
Mm.
and then you throw in, a ton of unknowns, and it gets really messy.
Yeah, like we were saying before, it's a pressure cooker. And it's not just one thing causing the pressure to build, right? But even with all that pressure, Taiwan is just trying to, I don't know, exist, to hold on to their way of life, their autonomy. But the analysis we've been looking at, it paints a pretty bleak picture for them, almost like they're uh, destined to be absorbed by China no matter what. Is that really the only way this can end?
I wouldn't say that. It's important to remember this is just one perspective,
Mhm.
and it's obviously biased, right? It's China's goals, their view of history, all that's baked into it. This isn't like some objective truth.
So there's still room for things to play out differently for, I don't know, maybe some unexpected twists and turns.
Of course.
Yeah.
The future isn't set in stone. Choices are made, alliances can form, strategies can change the whole game. And those choices, those decisions, they aren't just made by, you know, governments and armies. They're made by people, by citizens, by folks like the ones listening to us right now, in fact.
That's a good point. This isn't just some like far off problem that doesn't affect anyone else. We live in a connected world. Even a conflict that seems, you know, distant can have ripple effects that reach all of us. So what can our listener do about all of this? It's easy to feel powerless when you're talking about, these huge global forces.
Well, the first thing, the most powerful thing anyone can do is, well, to stay informed. Look for different perspectives. Try to really understand the nuances here. Don't just get your news from, headlines or social media sound
Do
bites.
your own deep dives, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Get into the details, question what you think you know, and think critically. And don't be afraid to have those difficult conversations, even when they get a little uncomfortable.
Because the more we understand these issues, the better equipped we are to, well, to make informed choices, whether it's how we vote, what we support, or even just the conversations we have with each other.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The point of this whole deep dive, it wasn't just to talk about China or Taiwan or U.S. foreign policy. It was about giving you, the listener, the tools to be more than just a spectator in all of this.
To be an active participant in shaping the world you want to live in.
Exactly. So, as we wrap things up here, we'll leave you with one final thought to chew on. If even half of what this analysis says is true, what does that tell us about how global power is shifting?
What does it mean for other countries, for other regions that are, caught in the middle of this whole rivalry?
And most importantly, what role do you want to play as this all unfolds? Because in a world facing these kinds of challenges, we need informed, engaged people now more than ever.
Well said. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. But remember, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep learning, keep thinking critically, and keep engaging with these important issues. Thanks for listening.